Shawn Lee hated boarding school for one very specific reason. Roommates. At Blackwood Academy, students were assigned rooms randomly, and for an Omega like him, that was a nightmare. Most people in the school did not know he was an Omega male. Shawn worked very hard to keep it that way. He wore scent blockers every day, took expensive suppressant pills even when they made him sick, and never let anyone get physically close enough to notice the faint smell of camellias hidden beneath the chemicals. Blackwood was full of wealthy alpha heirs, aggressive athletes, and students from powerful families. If his secret got out, Shawn knew exactly what would happen. At best, people would treat him differently. At worst, some alpha would decide he belonged to them. That was why Shawn kept his head down. He focused on grades, spent most of his free time reading or studying, and avoided parties, sports events, and basically everyone outside his two classmates, Ethan and Noah. He planned to survive another school year quietly. Unfortunately for him, the moment he pushed open the door to room 39, his plan died instantly. A tall blonde guy was already standing inside unpacking his bags. Shawn recognized him immediately. John Carter, captain of the Blackwood basketball team. Alpha dominant rank S. Son of Richard Carter, the CEO of Carter Global. Probably the most popular student in the entire academy. Shawn nearly dropped his suitcase. John looked up slowly, his sharp gray eyes locking onto Shawn's. For a second, Shawn felt his body freeze. Alpha pheromones. Strong. Heavy. Dangerous. Even suppressed, Shawn's Omega instincts reacted immediately. John narrowed his eyes slightly. Shawn knew that look. He smelled something. Crap. Shawn quickly stepped back and adjusted the black scent-canceling collar around his neck. I can request a room transfer tomorrow, he said immediately. John blinked once. Why? Because this room obviously isn't ideal. John stared at him for another second before calmly shutting the door behind him. You're Shawn Lee, right? Top student in sophomore year. Shawn frowned. How do you know that? You tutor half the basketball team before exams. Fair point. John walked toward his side of the room and continued unpacking like nothing happened. I'm not asking for a transfer. Shawn stayed tense. You should. John sighed softly before turning back toward him. Relax. I'm not going to expose you. Shawn's heart stopped. So he really knew. You Shawn swallowed hard. How long have you known? The moment you walked in. Of course. An S-rank alpha could smell through cheap suppressants easily. Shawn suddenly felt stupid for thinking otherwise. John tossed him a bottled water from the desk. Your suppressants smell too strong. You're overusing them. Shawn caught the bottle awkwardly. That's none of your business. Maybe not. But if you keep taking that much, your body's going to crash. Shawn hated how calm John sounded. Like secretly sharing a room with an Omega male was normal for him. For the next few hours, they unpacked in silence. Shawn tried focusing on arranging his textbooks and notes, but it was impossible not to notice John. Everything about him screamed alpha. Broad shoulders, deep voice, confident posture. Even his scent lingered heavily in the room, despite the scent diffusers attached near the windows. Around midnight, Shawn finally climbed into bed with his headphones on. John was still awake across the room, sitting on the edge of his bed scrolling through something on his phone. Then Shawn smelled it. The pheromones changed first. Sharp. Hot. Restless. Shawn sat up slowly. John! John immediately stood up too fast, knocking his chair backward. His breathing sounded uneven now. Go to sleep, John muttered. Shawn's stomach tightened. Rut. Not a full rut yet, but close enough. The scent flooding the room became heavier by the second. Shawn's Omega instincts reacted instantly. His pulse sped up and heat spread across his skin. Even with suppressants, an alpha like John was overwhelming. John grabbed a leather strap from his sports bag and wrapped it tightly around his own wrist. Shawn stared at him. What are you doing? Precaution. Against me? John laughed once, but there was no humor in it. Against myself. Before Shawn could respond, John secured the strap to the metal frame of the bed. His jaw tightened hard enough for Shawn to see the muscles move beneath his skin. You should leave the room, Shawn whispered. No, John leaned his head back against the wall, breathing slowly like he was forcing himself under control. If another alpha smells you outside right now, that'll be worse. The room fell silent except for their breathing. Shawn had met plenty of alphas before. Most of them acted entitled around Omegas, especially male Omegas. Some treated them like prizes. Others treated them like weak prey. But John was sitting there restraining himself like Shawn's safety mattered more than his own instincts. That confused Shawn more than anything. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Eventually Shawn climbed out of bed carefully and walked closer. John. John's eyes opened immediately. They looked darker now, almost silver under the dim light. You need to stay back. You're bleeding. The leather strap around John's wrist had cut into his skin from how tightly he was pulling against it. John looked away. I'm fine. No, you're not. For the first time that night, John looked genuinely irritated. Shawn, I said I'm handling it. Shawn hesitated before grabbing tissues from the desk drawer and kneeling beside him. The moment he got close enough, John inhaled sharply. The alpha scent around him spiked instantly. Shawn froze. John shut his eyes tightly and gripped the bed frame harder. You really need to stop getting close to me. Why? Because your pheromones smell too good. The words hit Shawn harder than expected. John opened his eyes again, calmer this time. But I meant what I said earlier. I'm not going to hurt you. Neither of them moved for several seconds. Then John suddenly leaned his head back against the wall again and let out a tired breath. Get some sleep, Omega. Shawn's face burned immediately at the word. John noticed and smirked faintly despite looking exhausted. Don't worry. Your secret's safe with me. Shawn slowly returned to his bed, but sleep never really came. All night he could hear the metal frame creaking softly every time John lost control for even a second. The next morning, sunlight spilled across room 39. Shawn opened his eyes and immediately looked across the room. John was asleep sitting against the wall, still tied to the bed frame. And both of his wrists were bleeding. Shawn spent the next few days trying very hard not to think about John Carter. That became impossible almost immediately. Everywhere Shawn went, people talked about him. In the cafeteria, students crowded around tables just to watch John and the Blackwood basketball team joke around after practice. In class, teachers praised him for balancing elite grades with athletics. Even outside the gym, girls and Omegas constantly tried getting his attention. But none of them saw the version Shawn saw inside room 39. They did not see John falling asleep face first on chemistry notes at 2 a.m. They did not see him reading poetry quietly near the window after practice. They definitely did not see him waking up before sunrise to force himself through cold showers whenever his alpha instincts became unstable around Shawn. And somehow, over the course of 1 week, that terrifying alpha started becoming the safest person Shawn had ever met. One evening, Shawn returned from class carrying a stack of books only to stop in the doorway. John was sitting at Shawn's desk. More specifically, John was holding Shawn's suppressant pills. Shawn's heart nearly stopped. Why are you touching those? John looked unimpressed. Because these are garbage. Shawn immediately walked over and snatched the bottle back. They work fine. No, they don't. John leaned back in the chair, arms crossed. Your scent spikes every few hours. The only reason nobody notices is because you drown yourself in blocker spray. Shawn hated that John was right. The truth was simple. High-grade suppressants were expensive. Shawn's parents already struggled to pay Blackwood tuition. Most months, Shawn skipped meals just to afford medication strong enough to hide his omega pheromones. John reached into his bag and placed another small box on the desk. Use these instead. Shawn frowned. What is this? Better suppressants. Shawn picked up the box and immediately recognized the brand. His eyes widened. These cost more than my monthly food budget. Then it's a good thing I already paid for them. I'm not accepting this. John looked at him calmly. You almost went into pheromone overload 2 nights ago. That still doesn't mean you should buy me things. John tilted his head slightly. Would you rather collapse during class? Shawn opened his mouth, then closed it again. Annoyingly, John always sounded reasonable. That night became the beginning of something strange between them. At first, Shawn told himself they were just roommates helping each other survive. Nothing more. But little moments kept piling up. John started waiting outside Shawn's afternoon classes, so they could walk back together. Shawn began tutoring him regularly after discovering the basketball captain was genuinely terrible at physics. Sometimes John would come back from practice exhausted and simply lay across Shawn's bed while Shawn studied nearby. You smell calmer when you read, John said one night randomly. Shawn glanced up from his book. That sentence sounds creepy. John smirked lazily without opening his eyes. Still true. Shawn rolled his eyes, but secretly his chest felt warm. The strangest part was how naturally they fit together. John stopped sleeping tied to the bed frame because Shawn's pheromones no longer made him spiral out of control immediately. Shawn also noticed his own anxiety fading whenever John was nearby. The alpha scent that terrified him on the first night now felt warm and steady instead. It scared him more than he wanted to admit. One rainy evening, Shawn sat cross-legged on his bed reading while thunder echoed outside the dorm building. John had just returned from basketball practice wearing a black hoodie soaked from the rain. "You're dripping water everywhere," Shawn complained. John ignored him completely and walked over to Shawn's bookshelf instead. "You really read all these?" "Yes." John pulled out a poetry collection and raised an eyebrow. "You like this stuff?" "Some people enjoy literature. Some people enjoy throwing balls through hoops," John replied casually. Shawn snorted before he could stop himself. John looked weirdly pleased about making him laugh. A few minutes later, John dropped onto Shawn's bed beside him without asking. Shawn tensed automatically. John noticed immediately. "Relax. You're literally taking up half my bed. You're tiny. There's still space." Shawn glared at him while John casually opened the poetry book in his hands. Then John started reading aloud. Shawn blinked in surprise. John's voice became softer while reading, slower than usual. Not performative. Not mocking. Genuine. "You actually like poetry?" Shawn asked quietly. John shrugged. "My mom did." The room suddenly became very still. John rarely talked about family. Most people only knew his father was a billionaire CEO and his mother died years ago. "She used to read to me when I couldn't sleep," John admitted. "After she died, I stopped touching books for a long time." Shawn watched him carefully. "What changed?" John looked over at him directly. "You." Shawn's heartbeat stumbled hard. Before he could respond, the dorm lights suddenly shut off. The entire room went dark. A storm warning alarm echoed faintly outside. "Great," Shawn muttered. Thunder shook the windows. Then Shawn felt it. His body temperature rising too fast. "No." His eyes widened in panic. The suppressant pills. He forgot to take them after dinner. Within seconds, dizziness hit him hard. Shawn grabbed the edge of the bed as heat spread painfully through his body. John sat up instantly. "Shawn!" The smell of camellias flooded the room. Strong. Sweet. Omega pheromones. John froze completely. Shawn's breathing became uneven. "Don't come closer." John immediately stood up and backed away instead. "Okay." Shawn's vision blurred. This was bad. Much worse than before. A premature heat. His body ached everywhere. John's scent filled the dark room heavily now too. Cedarwood. Smoke. Dangerous alpha pheromones reacting instinctively to an omega in heat. John grabbed the edge of the desk hard enough to crack the wood slightly. "John," Shawn whispered weakly. John looked like he was in pain. Every muscle in his body was tense. His breathing sounded rough now, barely controlled. "Tell me what you need," he said hoarsely. Shawn shook his head weakly. "You should leave." "And let another alpha smell you?" John snapped immediately. Then he closed his eyes and lowered his voice again. Not happening. Another wave of heat hit Shawn harder. A small broken sound escaped his throat before he could stop it. John immediately turned away from him completely. That somehow hurt Shawn's chest more. "Look at me," Shawn whispered. John did not move. "John." Slowly, John turned back. Even in darkness, Shawn could see how badly he was struggling. His pupils were blown wide. Veins stood out sharply along his arms from how hard he was restraining himself. Yet he still kept his distance. Still trying not to scare Shawn. That broke something inside him. Shawn stood shakily and crossed the room before his brain could catch up. John immediately grabbed his shoulders carefully to steady him. The contact sent heat through both of them instantly. "You shouldn't touch me right now," John warned quietly. "Then stop looking at me like I'm going to break." John stared at him silently. Rain slammed violently against the windows. Shawn's hands slowly grabbed the front of John's hoodie. "You're really not going to hurt me?" "Never." The answer came instantly. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Shawn looked into his eyes for one long second before pulling John down toward him. The kiss was clumsy at first. Warm. Desperate. Months of tension exploding all at once. John made a rough sound against Shawn's mouth like his control finally snapped. His hands gripped Shawn's waist tightly, but even then he held back, careful not to push too far. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. John rested his forehead against Shawn's carefully. "You have no idea what you're doing to me." Shawn's face burned. But before he could respond, voices suddenly echoed from the hallway outside. A group of basketball players walking past the dorm rooms. Then Shawn heard one of them laugh loudly. "Carter's roommate is still that weird little nerd, right? Honestly, if the guy turns out to be an Omega, Carter will probably get bored after one night anyway." John's entire expression darkened instantly. John stayed completely still after hearing the voices outside the dorm room, but Shawn could feel the change in him immediately. The warmth from the kiss disappeared beneath something colder, sharper. Protective. The basketball players kept talking as they walked down the hallway. "I'm serious," another alpha laughed. "Carter could have anyone in this school. No way he'd waste time on some quiet little bookworm." Their footsteps slowly faded away. Inside room 39, silence settled heavily between them. Shawn stepped back first. Reality crashed into him all at once. He had just kissed John Carter, the most desired alpha at Blackwood Academy. Worse, he had done it while half out of control during heat. His chest tightened with embarrassment. "Shawn," John started quietly. "That shouldn't have happened." John frowned immediately. "You regret it?" Shawn avoided his eyes. "You know what I mean." John watched him carefully for several seconds before speaking again. "No, actually I don't." Shawn let out a nervous breath and ran a hand through his hair. "John, you're the captain of the basketball team. Your father owns half the city. You're an alpha everyone respects. He hesitated. "I'm just me." John's expression hardened slightly. "And what exactly is wrong with being you?" "That's not what I'm saying." "It sounds exactly like what you're saying." The tension in the room shifted again. Not angry exactly, but emotional in a way Shawn did not know how to handle. John stepped closer slowly this time, giving Shawn enough space to back away if he wanted. He didn't. "You think I kissed you because your heat made me lose control?" John asked. Shawn stayed silent. John laughed softly, but there was frustration behind it. "Shawn, I've been losing control around you since the first night you walked into this room." Shawn's heartbeat sped up again. John continued staring directly at him. "You think tying myself to the bed every night was only about instincts." The room suddenly felt too small. Before Shawn could answer, John's phone buzzed loudly on the desk. The moment broke instantly. John checked the screen and cursed under his breath. "Coach, you should answer." John looked annoyed but picked up anyway. Shawn could hear the loud voice of Coach Daniels even from across the room. Blackwood's basketball coach was infamous for treating every practice like war. "Where the hell are you, Carter?" "Team meeting started 10 minutes ago." John glanced briefly toward Shawn before answering. "I'll be there." "You better." Walker's already running his mouth again. The call ended. John grabbed his hoodie from the floor. "We're not done talking about this." Shawn folded his arms defensively. "There's nothing to talk about." John walked closer again until they stood only inches apart. Shawn hated how easily the alpha's scent wrapped around him now. "You kissed me first," John reminded him quietly. Then he left the room before Shawn could respond. The next morning, Shawn regretted leaving room 39 almost immediately. The second he entered the cafeteria, he noticed people staring. Not openly. Not enough to cause a scene. But enough to make his stomach twist. At the center of the room sat the Blackwood basketball team. John was there beside Chris Walker, the team's vice captain and one of the strongest alpha players in school. Chris came from an old-money family and carried himself like he owned every room he entered. Unlike John, who stayed calm most of the time, Chris enjoyed intimidating people. The moment Shawn walked past their table, Chris smirked. "Well, look who finally left his cave." Several players laughed quietly. Shawn kept walking. Then Chris spoke again. "Careful, Lee. You smell sweeter than usual today." Shawn froze for half a second. Panic hit him instantly. Did Chris know? Shawn forced himself to keep moving, but before he could escape, another voice cut through the tension. "That's enough. John." The entire table fell silent. Chris leaned back in his chair casually. "Relax. I'm joking." John did not smile. "Find someone else to joke about." The atmosphere around the table shifted immediately. Even the other alphas looked uncomfortable now. Chris stared at John for a long second before raising both hands mockingly. "All right, Captain." Shawn quickly left the cafeteria before anyone noticed his shaking hands. Unfortunately, things only became worse after that. Chris started paying attention to him. Too much attention. In chemistry class, Chris deliberately sat behind Shawn despite usually avoiding academics entirely. During lab work, he leaned too close on purpose. Every time he spoke, he released small traces of alpha pheromones to pressure Shawn. Most betas could not even notice it. But Shawn definitely could. "You're nervous around alphas, huh?" Chris said one afternoon while Shawn measured chemicals carefully. "I'm busy." Chris smirked. That wasn't a denial. Shawn ignored him and focused harder on the experiment. That only seemed to amuse Chris more. "You know what I think?" Chris lowered his voice slightly. "I think you're hiding something." Shawn's grip tightened around the glass cylinder. Across the classroom, another student suddenly stood up from his desk. "Walker, leave him alone already." The interruption came from Daniel Reyes, one of Blackwood's basketball forwards, and surprisingly the nicest alpha on the team. Daniel looked annoyed as he walked closer. Chris rolled his eyes. "Mind your business." Daniel shrugged. "You're making it everyone's business." Chris clicked his tongue and finally backed away. Shawn let out a breath quietly after he left. "You okay?" Daniel asked. Shawn nodded quickly. "Yeah, thanks." Daniel studied him briefly before speaking again. "Chris gets worse when he's jealous." "Jealous?" He wanted to be team captain. Daniel lowered his voice carefully. "And lately John's been distracted. Chris thinks it's because of you." Shawn's chest tightened immediately. That night, Shawn returned to room 39 feeling exhausted. John was sitting at his desk reviewing game footage on a laptop when Shawn entered. The moment John looked up, his expression changed. "What happened?" "Nothing. You smell stressed." Shawn hated that alpha senses made lying impossible. John stood up immediately. "Did Walker say something to you?" Shawn stayed silent too long. John's jaw tightened. "He's been bothering you." "It's not a big deal." "To me it is." Shawn looked away. "I don't want you fighting your own team because of me." John walked over slowly until they stood face to face again. "Shawn, look at me." Reluctantly, Shawn did. John's expression softened instantly. "You are not causing problems for me." "Chris thinks I am." "I don't care what Chris thinks." The room became quiet again. Then John reached up carefully and touched the black collar around Shawn's neck. Shawn's breath caught. "You wear this thing so tightly," John murmured. "It helps hide my scent. It also hurts you." Before Shawn could respond, John slowly loosened the collar slightly. The small gesture felt far too intimate. John's fingers brushed the side of Shawn's neck gently, and Shawn's omega instincts reacted instantly. Heat spread through his chest. John noticed. Of course he noticed. The alpha smiled faintly before leaning closer. "You know," he said softly, "you blush every time I touch you." Shawn shoved him weakly. "Stop acting smug." John laughed quietly for the first time all day. Then suddenly, without warning, the dorm room door slammed open. Chris Walker stood there. And the first thing he saw was John standing very close to Shawn with one hand still resting near Shawn's collar. Chris Walker stood frozen in the doorway for a second, his sharp eyes moving between Shawn and John. The atmosphere inside room 39 changed instantly. John slowly removed his hand from Shawn's collar, but his expression stayed cold. "Ever heard of knocking?" Chris leaned against the doorframe casually, though the irritation in his face was obvious. "Coach sent me. Team meeting got moved earlier." John grabbed his jacket from the chair. "Then you could have texted." Chris ignored him and kept staring at Shawn instead. "Didn't realize I was interrupting something." Shawn immediately stepped back, uncomfortable under the alpha's gaze. John noticed. His pheromones shifted slightly, warning without words. Chris smirked faintly. "Relax, Captain. I'm leaving." But before walking out, Chris glanced at Shawn one more time. "See you in chemistry tomorrow." The door shut behind him. Silence filled the room again. Shawn rubbed the back of his neck nervously. He knows something. John's expression darkened. He suspects. That's worse. John walked closer. "Listen to me carefully. Walker likes power. If he really knew you were an omega, he wouldn't be throwing hints around. He'd use it immediately." That made sense, but Shawn still felt uneasy. John sighed softly. "I'll handle him." "That's exactly what I'm worried about." John frowned. "You think I can't?" "No. I think you will." Shawn looked at him seriously. "And if your team starts turning against you because of me?" "They won't. You don't know that." John stayed silent for a moment before answering quietly. I know exactly how far people in this school can go. Something in his tone made Shawn pause. Before he could ask what John meant, the alpha grabbed his bag and headed for the door. Lock the room tonight. John. I mean it. Then he left. The next few days became tense. Chris stopped pretending his interest in Shawn was harmless. During chemistry class, he constantly invaded Shawn's space, leaning too close whenever teachers turned away. Sometimes he released small amounts of alpha pheromones deliberately just to watch Shawn tense up. Shawn hated it. What scared him more was how nobody else seemed to notice. One afternoon, Shawn was organizing lab samples when Chris suddenly appeared beside him again. You smell different lately, Chris said casually. Shawn kept his eyes on the table. Maybe you should stop sniffing people. Chris laughed quietly. See, that attitude is interesting. He leaned closer. Most betas get nervous around me. You get defensive. I'm busy. You're hiding something. Shawn's pulse quickened. Chris suddenly reached toward Shawn's neck. Instinctively, Shawn stepped back too fast and knocked over a glass beaker. Chemicals splashed across the table loudly. Several students looked over. Walker, the teacher snapped sharply. Stop distracting your classmates. Chris raised both hands innocently and walked away, but the smirk on his face never disappeared. By the time Shawn returned to room 39 that evening, his nerves were completely wrecked. John noticed immediately. The alpha had been reviewing basketball plays on his laptop, but the moment Shawn entered, he closed it. What happened? Nothing. Shawn. Shawn exhaled tiredly and sat on his bed. Chris keeps bothering me. John's jaw tightened instantly. What did he do? He keeps trying to provoke me. That's not what I asked. Shawn hesitated before answering. He tried touching my collar today. The room went completely still. For several seconds, John said nothing at all. Then he stood up slowly. Where are you going? Shawn asked immediately. To talk to him. No. John looked at him sharply. No. You'll start a fight. He touched you. And if you beat him up, everyone's going to ask why you care so much. John looked genuinely angry now. Because I do care. The words hit harder than Shawn expected. John walked closer until he stood directly in front of him. You think I can sit here calmly while another alpha corners you? Shawn looked away first. That alone felt like an answer. John's expression softened slightly. Shawn. The Omega swallowed hard. You don't understand what this is like. Then explain it to me. Shawn laughed bitterly under his breath. You're John Carter. You walk into every room knowing nobody can touch you. I spend every day terrified someone will realize what I am. John stayed silent. Shawn continued quietly. One mistake is enough to ruin everything for me. For the first time since they met, John looked almost guilty. Then, without warning, he sat beside Shawn on the bed. The mattress dipped under his weight. You know what people see when they look at me? John asked suddenly. Shawn frowned slightly. They see the Carter name. The basketball captain. The future CEO. John looked down briefly. Nobody sees me. Shawn blinked in surprise. John leaned back against the wall. Most people don't even talk to me normally. They either want something from me or they're scared of me. That's not true. John glanced sideways at him. You weren't scared of me? I was terrified of you. John laughed quietly. But Shawn hesitated. You were the first alpha who didn't make me feel trapped. The room became silent again. John slowly turned toward him. You're the first person who treats me like I'm just a normal guy. Shawn's chest tightened. The distance between them suddenly felt dangerously small. John's gaze dropped briefly toward Shawn's lips before returning to his eyes again. Neither of them moved. Then a loud vibration broke the moment. John groaned softly and grabbed his phone from the bed. Coach again. Shawn smiled faintly. You should answer before he storms into the dorm. John picked up the call reluctantly. Coach Daniel sounded furious immediately. Carter, where the hell are you? Practice started 15 minutes ago. I'm coming. You better be. Walker's already whining about team chemistry again. John's expression darkened instantly. What did he say? That you're distracted this season. The call ended shortly after. John stood up slowly. Go, Shawn said quietly. But John did not move toward the door immediately. Instead, he looked down at Shawn carefully before speaking. You know he's trying to get under your skin because he's jealous, right? Jealous of what? John's mouth twitched slightly. Me paying attention to someone that isn't him. Shawn stared at him. Then John leaned down suddenly and pressed a quick kiss against Shawn's forehead. Soft. Gentle. Completely unexpected. By the time Shawn's brain caught up, John was already halfway out the door. "Lock the room tonight," he said again. Shawn touched his forehead slowly after the door closed. His heart would not calm down. The next day, Blackwood Academy held its first basketball game of the season. The gym was packed. Students screamed the moment John stepped onto the court wearing Blackwood's black jersey with captain stitched beneath his number. Even Shawn's classmates noticed him staring. Ethan smirked from beside him on the bleachers. "You've watched Carter warm up for 10 straight minutes. I'm supporting the school." "Sure you are." Shawn ignored him and focused back on the court. John looked different during games. Faster. Sharper. Dominant. Every movement drew attention naturally. But halfway through the second quarter, Shawn noticed something was wrong. Chris kept ignoring John's passes. Twice, he forced terrible shots instead of letting John score. The tension between them was obvious even from the stands. Then during a timeout, Chris suddenly shoved John hard enough for several players to step between them. The crowd murmured loudly. On the court, John's expression turned ice cold. And for the first time since Shawn met him, he looked genuinely ready to hurt someone. The tension on the basketball court became impossible to ignore after Chris shoved John during the timeout. Even students in the bleachers started whispering. "What's their problem? Did Walker seriously just push the captain?" Carter looks pissed. Shawn gripped the edge of his seat nervously. Down on the court, Coach Daniels stepped between the two alphas immediately before things could escalate further. "What the hell is wrong with both of you?" the coach snapped. Chris raised his hands mockingly. "Relax, coach. It was an accident." John looked like he wanted to punch him anyway. One of the assistant coaches quickly pulled John aside while the referees called players back into position. The game resumed, but the chemistry between Blackwood's players was completely broken. Chris continued hogging the ball. John stopped speaking almost entirely. Blackwood barely won by 4 points. The second the game ended, Shawn saw John walk straight toward the locker room without acknowledging anyone around him. Chris noticed Shawn watching. The alpha smirked from across the gym before deliberately bumping shoulders with him while leaving the court area. "You should tell your boyfriend to relax," Chris said quietly enough that only Shawn could hear. Shawn froze. Chris leaned slightly closer. "Yeah, I figured it out." Panic shot through Shawn instantly. Chris chuckled softly at his expression. "Don't look so scared. Your secret's cute." Before Shawn could respond, Chris walked away laughing. The ride back to the dorms felt awful. Shawn kept replaying the conversation in his head while staring at his phone. He considered texting John several times, but stopped himself every time. When he finally entered room 39, John was sitting on the edge of his bed with blood on his knuckles. Shawn shut the door quickly behind him. "What happened?" John glanced up. "Nothing. You're bleeding." Locker room argument. Shawn immediately walked over and grabbed the first aid kit from the shelf. "Give me your hand." John obeyed without arguing. That alone said enough about how exhausted he was. As Shawn cleaned the cuts carefully, he noticed bruises forming along John's jaw too. "You fought Chris." John leaned back slightly. "He started it." "Because of me?" John stayed silent. Shawn sighed softly. "John, he called you a distraction." John's voice turned colder. Then he started talking about omegas. Shawn's hands paused briefly. John noticed. "I didn't tell him anything." "I know." He figured it out himself. The room became quiet again. Shawn carefully wrapped gauze around John's knuckles while trying not to panic. "If Chris tells people." "He won't." "You don't know that." John gently grabbed Shawn's wrist before he could pull away. "Look at me." Reluctantly, Shawn did. John's expression softened immediately. "I won't let anything happen to you." Shawn wanted to believe him. The problem was that John sounded completely serious. That scared him more than anything. Over the next week, things only got worse. Chris became bolder after realizing Shawn and John were involved somehow. He stopped hiding his hostility completely. In the cafeteria, he made comments loud enough for nearby students to hear. During chemistry class, he purposely brushed against Shawn's scent collar whenever passing by. Sometimes he released alpha pheromones directly toward Shawn just to watch him tense up. And every single time, Shawn stayed silent because he knew exactly what would happen if John found out. Unfortunately, John noticed anyway. One evening after practice, John entered room 39 looking furious. What did Walker say to you today? Shawn looked up from his desk immediately. Nothing. Shawn. The alpha voice alone sent heat through Shawn's spine. John tossed his sports bag onto the floor. Daniel told me Walker cornered you outside chemistry. Shawn cursed internally. Daniel Reyes really needed to stop reporting everything. It wasn't a big deal. John laughed once without humor. You smell stressed every time you come near him. Shawn looked away. Can we not do this right now? No, John stepped closer. I'm done pretending this isn't happening. Before Shawn could respond, John suddenly grabbed the front of his hoodie gently and pulled him closer. Their bodies collided softly. Shawn's breath caught immediately. John lowered his voice. Do you know how hard it is for me to sit there every day watching another alpha bother you? You can't keep fighting people because of me. I can if they deserve it. That's exactly the problem. John stared at him for several long seconds before speaking again. You still think I'm going to get tired of you eventually, don't you? Shawn froze. John exhaled quietly. Shawn, I haven't been able to think straight since the day you walked into this room. The honesty in his voice made Shawn's chest ache. John leaned forward slowly until their foreheads touched. You're not some temporary thing to me. Shawn's Omega instincts reacted instantly to the closeness. His body relaxed automatically beneath John's scent. John noticed immediately. His expression softened. Then he tilted Shawn's chin upward carefully and kissed him. This kiss felt different from the first one. Slower. More deliberate. Like John wanted Shawn to understand exactly what he meant. Shawn kissed him back immediately. John's hands slid around his waist while Shawn grabbed the front of his shirt tightly. Their pheromones mixed heavily in the room now, warm and addictive. When John finally pulled back, his voice sounded rougher. You have no idea what you do to me. Shawn's face burned. You say that a lot. Because it keeps being true. A laugh escaped Shawn before he could stop it. John looked weirdly proud of himself for causing it. Then suddenly, someone slammed hard against the dorm room door from outside. Both of them froze instantly. Another loud bang followed. Open up, Chris. John's entire expression darkened immediately. The alpha walked toward the door before Shawn could stop him. John, wait. Too late. John yanked the door open hard enough to make Chris stumble slightly forward. Chris looked irritated and probably drunk. Several basketball players stood awkwardly behind him in the hallway, including Daniel, who already looked worried. Chris smirked when he saw Shawn standing behind John. There he is. John's voice turned dangerously calm. What do you want? I wanted to ask why our captain keeps skipping team parties to run back to his room every night. Then ask quickly and leave. Chris laughed mockingly. You know what I think? I think you're ruining the team over some Omega. The hallway went silent instantly. Several players looked horrified. Daniel muttered, Walker, stop talking. But Chris ignored him completely. His eyes moved toward Shawn again. Then he smiled cruelly. I wonder how everyone at Blackwood would react if they found out their perfect little scholarship student spends his nights spreading his legs for the basketball captain. The world seemed to stop. Shawn's blood ran cold. And John Carter finally snapped. Before anyone could react, John grabbed Chris by the throat and slammed him violently into the hallway wall. The impact shook the entire corridor. Every alpha nearby immediately backed away once John's pheromones exploded out of control. Pure dominant alpha pressure flooded the hallway. Chris's smirk vanished instantly. John's voice dropped into something terrifyingly calm. Say one more thing about him, he said slowly, and I'll break your jaw right here. Nobody in the hallway moved after John slammed Chris into the wall. The pressure from an S-rank alpha filled the corridor so heavily that even the other basketball players looked pale. Shawn could actually see Daniel struggling to breathe a few feet away. Chris tried to pry John's hand off his throat, but it barely moved. John, Shawn said quickly, panic rising in his chest. Stop. For a second, John did not react at all. His eyes stayed locked on Chris with a look Shawn had never seen before. Cold. Furious. Dangerous. Chris forced out a laugh anyway, though it sounded weaker now. What? Did I hit a nerve? John shoved him harder against the wall. You don't get to talk about him. The hallway lights flickered slightly from the overwhelming pheromones flooding the space. Daniel finally stepped forward carefully. Captain, coach is coming. That seemed to break through John's anger a little. Slowly, he released Chris and stepped back. Chris coughed harshly while rubbing his neck, but the hatred in his eyes only grew stronger. "This isn't over," he spat. John took one step forward again. Chris immediately backed away. The other players quickly dragged him down the hallway before things exploded a second time. The moment they disappeared, the pressure in the corridor finally eased. John stood completely still with his back toward Shawn. Then Shawn noticed something wrong. The alpha's hands were shaking. Not from fear. From barely controlled rage. Shawn slowly walked closer. "John." John spoke without turning around. "Go inside. You're bleeding again." "I said go inside." Shawn ignored him and grabbed his wrist gently. John flinched. That alone shocked Shawn more than anything else. Slowly, John turned around. The anger on his face was gone now. Exhaustion replaced it instead. "You shouldn't have heard that," John said quietly. Shawn swallowed hard. "He's wrong. I know. But people will talk now." John laughed bitterly. "People already talk." Shawn looked down at the floor. "Maybe this is getting too dangerous." Silence. Then John suddenly grabbed Shawn's face gently and forced him to look up again. "Don't." His voice sounded rough now. "Don't say things like that." Shawn's chest tightened painfully. "You deserve better than this mess," Shawn whispered. John stared at him for several long seconds before answering. "You still don't get it." Before Shawn could respond, John kissed him. Harder than before. Desperate. Like he was trying to silence every fear in Shawn's head at once. Shawn kissed him back immediately. The alpha's scent wrapped around him completely now, warm cedarwood mixed with smoke and something possessive underneath. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing unevenly. John rested his forehead against Shawn's. "You are not a mistake to me." That night, Shawn fell asleep beside John for the first time. Not in separate beds. Not pretending they were only roommates. John held him carefully against his chest while rain tapped softly against the dorm windows. For the first time in years, Shawn slept without fear. Unfortunately, peace at Blackwood never lasted long. 3 days later, the academy held the regional championship game. The entire school attended. Scouts from professional college teams filled the front rows to watch John play. Everything should have been perfect. Instead, Shawn realized something was wrong the moment he reached into his bag before the game. His suppressants were missing. His stomach dropped instantly. No. He searched the bag again desperately. Nothing. A cold realization hit him hard. Chris. Shawn immediately stood up from the bleachers, panic rising fast now. Without suppressants, being surrounded by hundreds of excited alphas inside a crowded gym was dangerous. Very dangerous. He pulled out his phone to text John. Then the first wave hit. Heat. Sharp and sudden. Shawn grabbed the railing beside him as dizziness slammed into his body. His scent blockers suddenly felt useless. Camellia pheromones escaped instantly. Nearby alphas started turning their heads. "Oh my God! Do you smell that? That's an omega." Fear shot through Shawn immediately. He stumbled away from the bleachers and hurried toward the locker room hallway before anyone could stop him. But someone grabbed his arm roughly halfway there. "Chris, you really should be more careful with your medication," Chris said softly. Shawn tried pulling away. "Let go of me." Chris shoved him hard into an empty locker room instead and locked the door behind them. "You're insane," Shawn snapped, panic growing worse by the second. Chris stepped closer slowly. "Do you know how humiliating this has been for me?" His voice shook with anger. "Watching Carter choose you over his own team?" Shawn's heat intensified painfully. Chris inhaled Shawn's pheromones deeply before smirking cruelly. "You know, once an omega gets marked, people stop caring who they belonged to before." Real fear finally hit Shawn. Outside the locker room, noise from the basketball game echoed faintly through the walls. Chris grabbed Shawn's wrist. Then suddenly, a deafening crash exploded through the room. The locker room door flew off its hinges. John stood there breathing heavily. For one terrifying second, nobody moved. Then Shawn smelled it. Dominant alpha pheromones. Completely out of control. Every instinct in Shawn's body reacted immediately to John. Chris cursed under his breath and stepped back. "John, calm down." John punched him before he could finish speaking. The impact sent Chris crashing into a row of metal lockers. Shawn had never seen violence like this before. Chris fought back immediately, slamming into John hard enough to split his lip open. Lockers dented. Metal crashed onto the floor. The entire room shook with furious alpha pheromones. But John was stronger. Much stronger. By the time Chris hit the ground again, blood covered half his face. John looked ready to keep going. Shawn's voice came out weak and shaky. Immediately, John stopped. The alpha turned toward him instantly, and the anger on his face disappeared the moment he saw Shawn trembling. "Hey," John said softly, crossing the room quickly. "I've got you." Shawn's heat was getting worse now. His entire body hurt. John pulled him carefully into his arms, but the moment their pheromones mixed fully, both of them froze. Instinct hit hard. Shawn grabbed John's shirt weakly. "It hurts." John looked completely torn apart inside. Then his eyes dropped toward Shawn's neck. "Shawn," he whispered shakily, "if I do this, everything changes." Another wave of heat hit Shawn painfully. He looked directly into John's eyes. "Then stay with me." That was all it took. John pulled Shawn closer and bit down firmly against his scent gland. Pain shot through Shawn first. Then warmth. Then overwhelming calm. The pheromone bond settled instantly between them. Permanent. Complete. Outside the locker room, voices shouted as teachers and security rushed closer. But inside John's arms, Shawn no longer cared. Because for the first time in his life, he finally felt safe. And that was how the invisible Omega of Blackwood Academy ended up kissing, loving, and bonding forever with the most popular alpha in school. Room 39 became the place where both of them finally found home. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us again for more wholesome BL stories.